In the heart of ancient Rome, beyond the marble columns and blood-soaked sands of the Colosseum, there existed a force greater than any gladiator, emperor, or army. It wore no crown, bore no sword, yet shaped the destiny of millions. This was the Roman Senate. It claimed to be the voice of the Republic. But behind closed doors, it was a chessboard, where betrayal, power, and manipulation thrived. And for over 1,000 years, it never blinked. Welcome to Thrones of Time. Today, we uncover the untold secrets of the Roman Senate, a body that outlived kings, crushed emperors, and ruled the world from the shadows. Long before Caesar's name echoed through eternity, before the legions marched across Europe, and even before Rome was more than a cluster of huts along the Tiber, there was the Senate. Its origin traces back to 509 BCE, the year the Romans overthrew their last king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, and founded the Roman Republic. But the Senate didn't rise as a beacon of freedom. It was created by Rome's elites, the patricians, to replace monarchy with oligarchy. The people had removed the king, yes, but the Senate became their new master. Back then, it was small. Just 100 men, all from noble families. They weren't elected by the people. They were appointed. They called themselves senators, the elders. Wise? Perhaps. Ruthless? Absolutely. The early Senate's purpose was advisory. They gave counsel to magistrates and consuls. But slowly, they began to weave their own web of power. To the world, the Republic looked democratic. Every year, 2 consuls were elected. There were assemblies of Roman citizens who could vote. Laws were debated. Tribunes protected the rights of the people. It was brilliant political theater. But behind that stage, the Senate pulled the strings. They controlled foreign policy, war declarations, taxation, and even religious rituals. They had the power to appoint dictators in times of crisis, a tool meant to be temporary, yet often exploited. They dictated which bills the assemblies could even vote on. And if they disliked a law passed by the people, they could simply nullify it by declaring it unconstitutional. This wasn't democracy. It was senatorial dominion, dressed in the clothes of liberty. The Senate became the gatekeeper of wealth, appointments, and honor. They shaped narratives through state-sponsored historians. They turned loyalty into currency, and ambition into a weapon. The real magic of the Senate wasn't in what it commanded, but how it seduced. In Roman society, to be a senator was the pinnacle of status. You wore the toga praetexta, a white robe with a purple stripe. You sat in the front rows at the theater. Your voice could determine the fate of provinces, generals, even kings. But with privilege, came plotting. The Senate was a battlefield of egos. Factions formed. The optimates. The conservative elite, defending tradition. The populace, those who claimed to represent the common people. It wasn't about ideology. It was about influence. Ambitious men like Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus tried to use the tribunate to bring land reform to the poor. The Senate saw them as threats, and had them killed. Rome didn't assassinate its enemies in back alleys. It did so on the Senate floor. And in doing so, it created martyrs. And martyrs gave rise to revolution. No man challenged the Senate more boldly than Gaius Julius Caesar. Born of noble blood but burdened by debt, Caesar rose through charisma, military brilliance, and public support. He knew how to manipulate the people, and how to sidestep the Senate. His crossing of the Rubicon in 49 BCE was more than an act of war. It was a declaration: the Senate does not control me. After defeating Pompey and his senatorial allies, Caesar returned to Rome, not as a consul, but as dictator for life. The Senate was cornered. Publicly, they honored him. Privately, they sharpened their daggers. On the Ides of March, 44 BCE, Caesar entered the Senate chamber, and never left. Stabbed 23 times, by 60 senators, including his friend Brutus, the message was clear. "You can rule Rome. But not without us." But in killing Caesar, they created a myth. And lit the fuse for the empire. When Julius Caesar fell beneath the daggers of his fellow senators, Rome gasped, not in relief, but in dread. The Senate had removed the man. But they had not removed the movement. Caesar's ghost loomed large. His supporters burned his body in the Forum. Riots erupted. His will named an heir, Gaius Octavius, just 18 years old. He would later be known by another name, Augustus, the first Roman emperor. And the Senate would never be the same. The fall of Caesar could have been the fall of the Senate. But Octavian was no fool. He didn't destroy the Senate. He seduced it. He wore the mask of a humble servant, a restorer of the Republic. In 27 BCE, he famously returned power to the Senate and people of Rome. The Senate, in return, gave him new titles. Augustus, the revered one. Princeps, first citizen. Imperator, commander. Rome was no longer a republic. It was now an empire, disguised as a republic. The Senate was preserved. It still met, still debated, still wore the robes of tradition. But it had become ceremonial, a stage on which Augustus played both actor and director. He filled the Senate with loyalists. He controlled its agenda. And through subtle reforms, he made sure no law passed without his shadow behind it. Augustus understood something Caesar did not. It was better to appear to serve the Senate, than to destroy it. And for that, he ruled for 40 years. For centuries after Augustus, emperors came and went. Some were wise. Some were mad. But the Senate endured. Why? Because it adapted. It became less of a decision-maker, and more of a legitimizer. A rubber stamp of approval for imperial power. It granted titles. Voted on imperial cults. Declared posthumous honors, or, in some cases, damnatio memoriae, erasing emperors from history. Yet, the Senate wasn't powerless. It could still be dangerous. Take Caligula, the mad emperor who mocked senators, forced them to run beside his chariot, and threatened to make his horse a consul. The Senate hated him. And in 41 CE, they had him assassinated. It was one of the few times in Roman history where a sitting emperor was murdered, not by soldiers or slaves, but by senators and palace insiders. But the Senate's power was reactive, not proactive. They couldn't stop emperors. But they could bury them. While the Senate survived through ceremony, it was never safe. Under Emperor Domitian, 81 to 96 CE, senatorial life became a gamble. Domitian distrusted the Senate. He bypassed it, ignored its votes, and ruled autocratically. But he also feared it. He launched purges. Senators were executed, exiled, or forced to commit suicide. Entire families vanished from the records. To be a senator under Domitian was to live under constant threat, where one wrong word could end your life. But tyranny breeds rebellion. In 96 CE, Domitian was stabbed in his palace by palace servants and praetorians, in what many believed was a senatorial conspiracy. Once again, the Senate had removed an emperor. But they still didn't hold power. They only whispered near it. Though diminished in legislative power, the Senate retained one essential role: it controlled the aristocracy. Senators came from Rome's richest, most ancient families. They owned land across the empire. They controlled temples, schools, and law courts. They sponsored festivals and gladiator games, not for fun, but for influence. Want to be loved by the people? Fund a spectacle. Want a military command? Make the right friends in the curia. They used their wealth not only to remain relevant, but to train their sons, form dynasties, and become the kingmakers behind emperors. While emperors ruled from palaces, the Senate ruled through inheritance, marriage, and memory. For much of Roman history, the Senate held the power to declare war. But under the empire, this authority shifted. The real power now rested in the legions, and those who led them. When emperors were weak, generals rose. And many senators, desperate for relevance, courted military commanders, backed coups, or even financed revolts. The year of the four emperors, 69 CE, was the ultimate proof. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, Vespasian. All rose and fell by the sword, not the Senate. Yet, after each civil war, the Senate quietly reassembled, like a cockroach after fire. Scarred, but alive. For centuries, the Roman Senate thrived in the shadow of emperors. It lost battles. It lost power. But it never lost its identity. That identity was forged in pagan tradition, a Rome of Jupiter, Mars, and Venus. The Senate's rituals, festivals, and authority were tied to the gods of old. But in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, a new force arrived, not with armies, but with prayers. It was not a man. It was a movement. The rise of Christianity was more than a religious shift. It was an existential threat to the Senate's world. Christianity denied the Roman gods. It rejected the old temples, the priesthoods, the rituals, everything the Senate had used for centuries to assert influence. At first, the Senate stood with the emperors, not out of faith, but out of fear. Under Diocletian and Galerius, the Senate backed purges of Christians. Churches were destroyed. Scriptures burned. Christians fed to lions. But still, the cross spread. And then came Constantine. In 312 CE, Constantine claimed victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, under the sign of the Christian cross. 1 year later, he issued the Edict of Milan, legalizing Christianity across the empire. For the Senate, this was not just a legal problem. It was a cosmic upheaval. Many senators were still devout pagans. They still held public ceremonies to Jupiter. They still sponsored gladiatorial games in honor of Mars. But now, the emperor was funding churches, not temples. Bishops replaced augurs. Crosses replaced laurel wreaths. The Senate, for the first time, was divided, not by class, but by faith. Some senators converted to Christianity to keep favor. Others resisted, clinging to dying gods. And in 382 CE, paganism was officially outlawed. Temples were closed. Statues smashed. And the altar of victory, the Senate's sacred symbol, was removed from the Curia. The Senate protested, but the empire had moved on. By the 5th century CE, the Roman Senate was a shell of its former self. It still existed, it still met in the Curia Julia. But now, it had no army, no treasury, no gods, and no voice in the wider empire. The emperors were often in Constantinople, ruling the Eastern Roman Empire from afar. The West, Rome itself, was a decaying corpse, barely breathing. Still, the Senate held on. It continued to vote on ceremonial matters. It honored emperors, advised on laws, and tried to preserve Roman traditions. It even negotiated with barbarians, like when Senator Symmachus begged the Visigoths not to sack the city. But diplomacy failed. In 410 CE, Alaric the Visigoth entered Rome, the first sack in 800 years. The Senate, for all its history, could do nothing. In 476 CE, the Western Roman Empire officially fell. The barbarian general Odoacer deposed the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus, sending the imperial regalia to Constantinople. It was over. Rome had fallen. But strangely, the Senate still lived. Why? Because Odoacer and later Theodoric the Ostrogoth recognized its value. Not as a political body, but as a symbol. The Senate gave legitimacy. It gave historical continuity. It reminded the people that Rome, in some form, still endured. Even after centuries of irrelevance, the name, senator, still carried weight. These men continued to meet, to debate, to write letters to Constantinople. The Senate had become a ghost, but a ghost that still haunted the world. For nearly 1,000 years, the Senate endured. But around the year 603 CE, it vanished from history. The Byzantine Emperor Phocas stopped consulting it. Rome was no longer a center of power. The Curia crumbled. The marble steps grew moss. The titles faded. The meetings stopped. And so, without bloodshed, without applause, the Senate of Rome ended. No empire in history had such a governing body last so long, from the kings of old to the Christian emperors, from republic to empire, from Caesar to Constantine. It wasn't the strongest army. It wasn't the loudest voice. But it was the longest game ever played in the history of politics. The Roman Senate officially met its end in the 7th century CE. But if you think its influence died with it, think again. The power of the Senate was never only in law or office. It lived in how it shaped perception, controlled narratives, and influenced the destiny of rulers without lifting a single sword. This final chapter is not about dates. It's about secrets, how the Senate bent the world to its will from the shadows. For centuries, the Roman Senate perfected one of the most terrifying political arts: elimination by subtlety. When a political enemy became too popular or too powerful, he was denounced, disgraced, or destroyed. Sometimes by votes. Sometimes by daggers. Julius Caesar was not the first. Dozens of tribunes, consuls, and reformers were murdered under the vague justification of defending the republic. Tiberius Gracchus, clubbed to death by senators in 133 BCE. Gaius Gracchus, driven to suicide during a Senate-approved manhunt. Cicero, a former consul, had his hands and head nailed to the rostra by senatorial order. The Senate didn't always use force itself. It knew how to whisper, how to defame, how to accuse without proof. They called it Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final decree. A license to kill in the name of the state. This wasn't just political. It was ritualistic. Remove the head. Control the body. Rome did not run on laws. It ran on favors. The Senate mastered the art of client-patron relationships. Each senator had a following, a crowd of clients who depended on him for jobs, protection, or legal help. In return, they gave loyalty, votes, and service. This system created vast webs of influence that stretched from the Senate chamber to the slums of Rome, and across the provinces. When a new law was proposed, it didn't matter if it was good. What mattered was who owed whom a favor, whose client would benefit, whose enemy would lose. Senators didn't need armies. They had networks. And those networks could make or break careers, even emperors. Even as Christianity spread, the Senate clung to its ritual power. They consulted the Sibylline books, ancient scrolls said to predict the future. They sacrificed animals and read their entrails for signs from the gods. They interpreted eclipses, lightning, and plagues as political omens. This wasn't superstition. It was theater, a way to legitimize or block decisions based on divine will. Want to delay an election? Call it an inauspicious day. Want to discredit a general? Claim the gods disapprove of his triumph. It was subtle, powerful, and no one could argue against the will of Jupiter. Even emperors feared the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest, often a senator, who controlled Rome's sacred calendar. By controlling religion, the Senate controlled time itself. Though the Roman Senate disappeared over a millennium ago, its fingerprints remain everywhere. The U.S. Senate takes its name and structure from it. Parliaments use debate, procedure, and oration, all Roman inventions. Even the phrase, Senatus Populusque Romanus, SPQR, the Senate and people of Rome, lives on as a symbol of state power. Why? Because the Roman Senate didn't just govern. It modeled governance. It taught future civilizations How to balance public image with real power. How to rule through prestige, not brute force. How to use tradition to maintain control in times of chaos. In the end, the Roman Senate was not a building. It was an idea. A masterclass in survival. A playbook for politicians, emperors, and rulers, written in ambition and preserved in marble. The Roman Senate began as a council of elders, 100 men advising a king. It evolved into the beating heart of a republic. It resisted emperors, survived sackings, and outlived the gods themselves. And though its walls crumbled, its methods never died. Even today, in every chamber of power, in every government that claims to rule for the people, you can still hear the whisper. The Senate is watching. Subscribe to Thrones of Time, because the past isn't dead. It's just hiding in plain sight.